Hello, this is Stephen. This is the Bureau of Lost Culture. As regular listeners know, there's nothing we like better here at the Bureau of Lost Culture than to uncover, collect, recover half-remembered, half-lost or rare stories. And in this case, I would say rare people. Kitty Empire said that the musician Arthur Russell occupies a strange slot in the annals of music. A low-key cult figure in his lifetime, became a minor legend among clubland cognoscenti thanks to a handful of woozy bangers he put out in the early 80s at hallowed New York clubs such as Paradise Garage, before percolating out to Chicago, Ibiza and beyond. But Arthur's prodigious output and his refusal to have his work pinned down has, in the decades since his death from an AIDS-related illness in 1992, created a small cottage industry of admirers. And one of those admirers, Richard King, has published a wonderful book about the musician Arthur Russell. It's called Travels Over Feeling, Arthur Russell Alive. There's a beautiful collage, a visual archive of Arthur's life and times. Now, for some listeners, I'm guessing that they know all about Arthur Russell already, but he was completely new to me until recently. And there's always that wonderful pleasure of discovering an artist who you knew nothing about. And in Arthur's case, a growing catalogue of really quite extraordinary songs and pieces, just in terms of their breadth, all kind of united, as Richard says, by his voice and his personal intimacy with the music, as we're going to hear. But before we get into all that, I'd like to invite you to join us at the Bureau. Sign up for our Bulletin of Lost Culture so that you can send us your thoughts and suggestions. Love to hear about artists that you have uncovered who are rare to most of us. We always love to hear from friends. I want to say thanks to Camilla, to Peter, Andrea and Andrew, who have written to me with suggestions recently. Now, back to today and my guest, the writer Richard King, who has written this beautiful book about Arthur Russell. We'll find out about Arthur Russell's life, but also we get into things like indie record shop culture, musical snobbery and generosity, the underground New York club scene of the mid-70s and early 80s. And we ask the question, how do we know when a song or a book or a piece of art is finished? And we're going to hear some clips from Arthur's music, thanks to Steve Knutson at Audica Records and Kat Gorian at Beggar's Banquet. Much appreciated. Here we go. Welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture, Richard.
Thank you, Stephen. Lovely to be here.
Yeah, I mean, congratulations on this book. It's a bit more than a book in a way, isn't it? I mean, it's obviously you've called it a life, and because it's the way it is, collaged biography with all this kind of ephemera from Arthur Russell's life. It's a compendium sort of / labour of love, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I tried to put together a chronology of his life to at least an approximation of Arthur Russell in his own words.
I said in the intro a little bit about Arthur Russell then, and you're going to really give listeners an intro to him and his life and his work. Before we do, let's just hear a bit about Richard King. Now, apart from this book, your oeuvre, is that we call it, repertoire, it's quite wide-ranging, isn't it? How Soon is Now, your survey of indie labels of the 80s. Right?
Yeah.
Lark Ascending, which we were just talking about, the way the English countryside and character have been shaped by the arts and music. Brittle with Relics, your history of Wales, right? 1960s to 1997. That sounds interesting because you've got the countercultural years in there. And then Original Rockers.
Yeah.
I'm going to end with mentioning that one because Bristol, massive attack, the Bristol music scene, which we've never covered on this show, interestingly. But you worked in a record store.
I worked in an independent record shop called Revolver Records, which was part of a thing called The Cartel, which was this rather idealistic chain of record shops that formed a distribution network for Rough Trade Records. A-grade independent record shop in the that came out of punk in the late 70s and thrived in the 80s and for about half the 90s, and that's when I was working there in the early to mid 90s. But go through one of the doors and 3D's graffiti, 3D for Massive Attack, would be on the door. Grant from Massive, Daddy G worked behind the counter. The owner used to joke that all the samples for Blue Lines came from the second-hand section. We used to import all our reggae from Jamaica, and it's just before my time, but the sound system operators would buy their pre's, their test pressings, in this sort of strange form of auction where a few seconds, half a bar of a new dub track would be played, and one of the operators would put their hand up, and if there were 3 copies, they'd buy all of them. So it was sort of buying exclusivity and ownership
so
of
nobody
a
else
track.
could get it, so you could drop it first.
Exactly, and then Grant would do exactly the same with New York Electro 5, 6, 7 years later, and he'd go into Revolver and say, can you get me Beat the Street by Shan Red or whatever it was, and Grant would say, no, that's really hard to get, and then he'd hear him playing it later that night.
So to buy a record from Revolver, you said, was to become involved in a limitless series of negotiations, diatribes, monologues and disputes. And you also said that Roger, the owner, would persuade customers to buy records he thought were better than the ones that they're coming to buy. Classic sort of indie record store stuff, isn't it?
Part of me sort of shudders with embarrassment at the snobbery, and look, I don't think there was sort of misogyny, but I think many women felt kind of comfortable going in there on their own.
They were a bit boys' club, weren't they?
Yeah.
I mean, when I lived in Portobello, I used to get Rough Trade West. You did feel stepping through the door that you needed to be a bit sort of educated
on your
stuff.
metal.
Yeah, before you went in there, or else you might get a withering look from somebody behind the counter if you asked for the wrong thing.
Sure.
But then you get great recommendations, right?
That's the sort of quid pro quo, isn't it? I'm not terribly proud of it. I remember I was young, but it gave me an incredible education in music.
They're run by music lovers, aren't they? You know,
Yes.
And it's because it's often a labour of love rather than a huge commercial concern. And so part of the pleasure of being behind the counter is that you're a counter curator of some sort.
Yeah, we sold second-hand as well as new records, and I realised how little influence really the music papers had on what people bought, at least in our shop. People would very rarely ask for the single of the week in the NME, but I remember the first Ortega album, for example, whatever that was, 93, 94, we could sell 10 copies of that a day for about a month.
Okay.
And that was just a record people had heard around someone else's house. And people would buy that, and they'd also buy a second-hand King Tubby record. And I realised that people come to music, people with a love of music come to it with a very, very open mind. When you get to sort of early 90s and dance music, the records we sold there, I assume people heard them at raves or they heard it on pirate radio, but there was the economy we had there was very much felt like it was how people enjoyed music, and they weren't being informed by or sort of mediated in their purchase.
Or maybe, as you say, by the kind of alternative means of pirate radio and friends' recommendations. So it was a kind of community/cognoscienti of...
And people who knew a lot about music anyway, older people. You know, the other thing I really enjoyed about it was we did sell a lot of reggae. I remember when we had the first Tricky single, and we probably sold about 300 copies of that, and people would just come and say, have you got the Tricky, have you got the Tricky? And you kind of knew when people walked through the door that they wanted it, and that felt very much sort of connected to the culture of the city.
But Nigel at Rough Trade West, bless him, I mean, I always felt that I was going to, whatever he recommended, even if I didn't get it straight away, I was going to end up loving it, you know, somehow. And so he'd always tell me what I'd gone in for, but also sort of say, I've listened to this. Because he's a bit older, you know, and he didn't have that fixed thing about, you know, I like post-rock, or you got a bit of a wider sweep.
No, I do occasionally get emails or messages from people saying, I have very fond memories of you forcing X, Y, and Z on me.
But listen, that was then.
Yeah.
This is now. And of course, your most recent book, Travels Over Feeling, Arthur Russell a Life. And I'm guessing, is that how you found out about Arthur Russell?
Yeah, that's where I first heard Arthur was
Right.
in Revolver
Right.
in 1994 when Another Thought was released. It was released on Point Records, which was Philip Glass's label.
And that was 2 years after he died.
Yes,
Arthur
so-
Russell was dead in 1992, right?
92. So one of the really fascinating things about Arthur is only 2 albums were released under his name in full in his lifetime. World of Echo and Tower of Meaning. But nearly everything we've come to know about Arthur, we've come to know in this music being not reissued, not re-released, not...
The retrospective releases, aren't
yes.
they? I mean, he's the post-mortem, not albums that he made, the albums that have been sort of collaged, compiled by people who loved him, or loved his music at least, right?
Tom Lee, his partners, had a hand in all of it, so definitely people who loved him. And Another Thought was the first of these. I remember playing it and thinking, I've never heard anything like this. I think I like it. I also remember distinctively thinking, I don't know what I meant to think about it.
Right. Well, one of the things which is, maybe one of the signature things about his work is that it's all over the place, isn't it? I mean, right from kind of avant-garde through to disco, with country, some very, very heart-rending torch song almost, right? And then lo-fi, hip-hop.
I'll close my eyes and listen to hear the corn come out. Don't you hear the stars? They glisten as we go in and out. Down where the trees grow together and the western path comes to an end. You see the sign, it says clear weather. I'll meet you tonight, my friend. Will the corn be growing a little tonight? As I wait in the fields for you, who knows what grows in the morning light when we can feel the watery dew. I just can't be there with no other. I know those hills will be true, away from my sister and brother, down through the grasses so new. The air is sweet.
There are two things that are constant in all his work. One, whatever vector he's creating in, it sounds like him.
Right.
That's largely to do with his voice and the sound of the cello. The other element is, I'd argue, that there's a sort of degree of integrity to everything he attempted. So when he's making a release for the dance floor, it still sounds like him, and it sounds a bit eccentric, but it works through a club PA. It wasn't as though he decided to give one of his tracks a remix or put a beat behind it. It was absolutely foursquare, 100% behind the idea of making a track that would work in the Loft or Paradise Garage.
Right, it's like he got inside the music that he was going to do, that whatever it was, or the world in which he was going to write this music for, whether it be some off-Broadway strange play, which he was soundtracking, or like in these New York disco clubs. So for you, it's 30 years ago, Richard.
Yeah.
You heard that record in the record store. You probably didn't realise at the time that 30 years later you're going to be publishing a book about Arthur Russell.
No.
That's a long time of I don't know. I don't want to use the word fandom because but it maybe is that, but or a long life of loving his work.
Yeah, I 30 years ago I only really knew Another Thought. Then about 5 years later I started hearing things like Go Bang and Is It All Over My Face. I have a vivid memory of a friend of mine playing it while we were DJing together and thinking, wow, what the hell's this? And that was Go Bang. And interestingly, in the US, that minimalist composer idiom he's in, that's taken very, very seriously. And in this country, I think probably because clubs are just normal and dancing's normal, the turn of this century, for the first sort of 5 years, as Audica started putting his music out in the world, like lots of people, I did start to get very, very smitten with the breadth of it all.
I mean, it's a generous thing, isn't it, if you've discovered somebody, because there's that sort of private pleasure, isn't there, of being in the know, discovering some sort of lost or forgotten treasure.
That's an excellent point. I still think he occupies the position of something of an open secret. Certainly when I was working on this book, people said, what are you working on? And my kind of head friends absolutely hadn't heard of him.
Yeah. This is never going to be everybody's cup of tea, as you say, the eccentric nature of it, the personal nature of it. And even though there are some banging tunes and there's some really beautiful ballads, aren't there? But it's not like it's going to be all over the charts. But he has become much better known. And this is going to help even more so. And there was the show at the Barbican recently, wasn't there? For people who don't know about Arthur Russell, why don't we sort of back up the truck and take them through who he was? Country boy, born in Iowa,
1952. Born into a family that's very much at the sort of apotheosis of the Eisenhower Great Society.
Meaning?
His father runs a very successful insurance business. They have access to a summer house. They also, meaning it's very conventional. He's the youngest of 3 children. He has 2 older sisters. His mother's a cellist, and his father was twice the mayor of their town.
So middle class.
Very middle class, successful, prosperous, conventional.
American dream.
Arthur hid his sexuality from his family for nearly his entire life. So a place that he found very stifling. There's a letter in the book from him aged about 16 talking about how he'd been reading Ferlinghetti and Ginsberg and studying John Cage, and he had to get out of there. He becomes one of those characters Joan Didion writes about in Slouching Towards Bethlehem, someone on the hate in San Francisco in 67, 68, looking for something, although possibly he's not quite sure what. So he's a teenage runaway in San Francisco.
Right, so he did that thing of leaving behind the middle class Peyton Place style family and heading west to where it was all happening.
Yes.
Drawn by the kind of beat poets and the...
Yes.
And probably possibly propelled by his own queerness in some way, or a sense of otherness.
I think the queerness is yet to manifest itself because he has a girlfriend in San Francisco. Within a year, he's actually met Allen Ginsberg, but he meets him because while in San Francisco, he joins a commune, a Buddhist commune. He gets arrested for selling marijuana, and he cuts the first of many deals with his folks, where he says, I'll go back to school if I stay here, and he enrolls in Ali Akbar College of Composition and starts his musical career, and he plays cello for the commune's house band, and while playing in a park in San Francisco, he is spotted by Allen Ginsberg, who I think it's well known had an eye for young men.
Yep.
And through Allen is basically encouraged to go to New York to record with John Hammond.
It's quite a leap, isn't it, immediately? I mean, just to say, you mentioned that his mum was a cellist too, but in terms of his own love for music, which then becomes an obsession, did that manifest quite early?
Yes. His first girlfriend, Muriel, who I spoke to, said from morning, noon and night, he was obsessed with playing his cello. And he was obsessed with composition. He would earn a little money doing notation and transcription for other people around him. But it's absolutely, she said, completely committed to his music, and she'd never met anyone like him as driven as that. According to Muriel, it was the offer of recording with John Hammond that led to the migration to New York.
Right.
And when he was first there, he lived in one of Ginsberg's apartments, though not with Allen. Within a year, he's musical director of The Kitchen, which was founded as a video space, even in the early 70s.
Right, like an avant-garde community arts lab type place.
Exactly. Right? But I think it's interesting that it's video, even in 72. He's musical director there, Steve Reich, Philip Glass, lots of people he'd go on to play with throughout his life, but are all in this milieu of what became known as new music. It's not a phrase I think we're over familiar with in the UK. A sort of trite way of describing it would be kind of avant-garde street music. It's essentially people who've got a high proficiency and probably a classical training and know how to write scores, all pushing the envelope.
his Catholicism when it came to music surfaces even there, doesn't it? Because, you know, it's like if you go to Eclectic or, you know, Cafe Oto in London, you know, you're not gonna see somebody with an acoustic guitar singing a song, right? You know,
not often.
But he, as well as putting on and programming some pretty wild, weird stuff, he also put on Jonathan Richman, right?
Yes, and he
the Modern Lovers, you know, sort of playing 2-3 chord punky post-punk songs, right?
Yes, and he got I think they were raised eyebrows. So yes,
but that's quite important. It seemed quite important to me because he also writes those sort of songs himself, doesn't he? Later, even early on, he wasn't like bothered about this, you know, slightly sniffy, we do avant-garde, you know, wild, weird stuff. And people who write sort of 3-chord songs are kind of old school. You know what I mean?
Completely.
He wasn't interested in those
Not
boundaries,
at all.
was he?
No, and you know, there's a reason why most people listening to this program will have heard of Steve Reich and Philip Glass, and that's because they've dedicated their life to that one type of music and not decided one day to start writing strange songs or making disco records.
That's a really good point. Do you then think that his lack of success was the fact that he didn't focus on one thing? Because if you do a lot of even if you do it amazing like he did, right, you're difficult to market, you're difficult to program, record labels get confused and...
Absolutely all those things. And especially in New York in the 70s and 80s, particularly the 1980s. That's the decade he was most active. There were riches to be gained by becoming a composer. But for whatever reason, Arthur didn't think in those terms. And staying in your lane and occupying a space, defining it and owning it is the formula for success in the era he's most active. And Arthur wanted to be successful, and he was very frustrated that he wasn't more successful. But it strikes me that it would have been very hard for him to be successful at that time. Now, creative practice has rather caught up with that.
Even then, possibly then, you could do it over a career. So you could go move from sort of a Dylan-esque cooking a guitar through to a kind of high concept album, maybe over a period of 20 years. Once you'd kind of established yourself.
Yes, I suppose someone like David Byrne, towards the end of the 80s, people were calling him a Renaissance man, but that's after being in one of the world's biggest bands.
Right.
That you can...
Well, David Bowie.
Than David Bowie. Right. To do that as someone on the breadline.
All at once.
All at once. Well, in 1980, he's working on an opera with Robert Wilson. He put out 2, let's call them disco records. Yeah. He probably played 100 shows, and he was writing strange songs and played in a band called The Necessaries and other bands for a while.
Play cello for other people.
Absolutely. If it's Wednesday, I'll play cello for Peter Zuma. If it's Friday, Peter Zuma will play trombone for me, and we'll both play to 40 people in the Lower East Side.
He's got his entree into New York through the kitchen. Tell us about what New York, or his New York, was like, and his move into more disco rock. It sounded like it was a particular little world in Manhattan of arty, mainly gay.
Yes, there's a great many queer people there. In the East Village, in the late 70s, early 80s, it was possible through an accident of social democracy and capitalism to the point where New York nearly lost its funding to survive, to run its basic facilities. It was possible, if you didn't mind living in a fairly basic manner, to live and work for very little income. He never had a kind of part-time job, apart from 2 attempts at being a bike courier that were very unsuccessful. Most of his friends could work 7 days a month in a jingle studio as transcribers, as hired hands in recording studio, tape op or tape cleaning, dubbing. And if they worked 7 days a month, the rest of the month, they could get on with their lives. They were working to live at a point where rents were very, very cheap, food was very, very cheap, and there were more spaces than you could conceive of to actually practice and demonstrate what you've been up to. And several communities were attracted to that, enough to provide an audience for all that activity. Within that, you then have clubs like the Loft and Paradise Garage, Mud Club, Tier 3, several others, where music was undergoing a sort of fermentation in response to that community, and music was being made by that community. And some of that music was played on WBLS by Frankie Crocker and other DJs. That was the Black Music Station New York, and certainly in the late 70s, early 80s, you would hear WBLS on every street corner coming out of people's boomboxes or out of their cars. A couple of Arthur's singles were played on WBLS, and every Saturday night Frankie Crocker would go to the Paradise Garage at a certain time, and people would prime Larry Levan to say, please play my track when Frankie's there, so we can see how the crowd reacts.
Disco happened. As soon as it was starting in obscure studios, he was there. Arthur said he wanted to make mass market music. He wanted to experiment with that.
Kids were dancing, and his quest was, well, what makes them get out on the dance floor?
I met Arthur at the Loft. The Loft was this place where David Mancuso had this concept of having a non-profit party where he would bring people in, you would pay a donation. There was a giant room which had a giant mirrored ball. There'd be free water, bowls of fruit, a lot of drugs, where there was a sense of feeling safe, white, gay, black gay, Spanish gay, and some hippies. It was a party. It was like a birthday party for kids.
I was back and forth on the road with James Brown, and Bob was playing this music, and all of a sudden I'm hearing this funky organ playing. It was like funky music, and I'm like, who is this? He said, oh, this is Arthur. I said, not that little white boy, that strange little white boy. He said, yeah. He had to be the funkiest white boy that I had ever met. So he came in and he told me the line, and he cranked the music up, and he said, okay, let's try it. And I would go, bang-a-bang, bang. He said, I want it crazier. And I'd go, bang-a-bang, bang. And he'd go, crazier. Bang-a-bang, bang, go bang, go bang-a-bang, bang, go bang, and bang-a-bang, bang, go bang, 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 go bang, and
We're talking about a street level, not a black economy, but certainly a grey economy. If you are going to sublet an apartment or live in an apartment with not regular electricity or no phone number, you will be hustling. You will be able to spend so much of your time working out who you are as an artist, as a creative person, as an author, whatever it is you've moved there to do. It's what do you want to do, not who do you want to be. However, within that comes the likelihood one of your records might be bootlegged. You might not get royalties, find it difficult to get paid properly. You might get mugged. So you're in a world, and that's the one you've chosen to live in. And I think for most people, they are all extremely grateful and know the value of what they lived through. It happened in Paris in the 1910s, 1920s, and it happened in New York in the 70s and 80s.
So it's that kind of New York that maybe we're familiar with from sort of 70s, 80s movies, you know, burnt out cars and sort of rubbish piled high and people sitting on stoops, boom boxes and stuff, and quite a lot of sort of high crime and all. Quite different than the Manhattan of these days.
People like Arthur, you know, he was a runaway initially to San Francisco, but there were people who moved there from the Midwest,
Right.
and they wanted to live with Puerto Ricans, with Ukrainians, with people who weren't jocks, essentially. And there were people who wanted to be among people exploring their sexuality, or people who weren't white, and they wanted to feel that they could just live a very, very singular life where everything's up for grabs.
Previous guest on here is Youth, bass player of Killing Joke, a music producer, and when he talks about London, second half of the 70s, same sort of time, I mean, it's quite similar in a way, you know,
Yeah.
living in squats in Ladbroke Grove.
Or Brixton,
Yeah, Brixton, cheap to live, lots of different people mixing together,
Yeah.
and time and space to do your thing.
Crucially, in both those examples, it's people right in the heart of the centre of a city,
That's
not
right.
on the fringes.
Not on the fringes,
And
yeah.
I think I worked out that Arthur probably could have walked to nearly 70% of the concerts he ever played.
Still friends with Allen Ginsberg, living in the flat upstairs.
Yeah.
They haven't got any money, or they haven't got enough. They haven't got electric, so someone's rigged up a electric cable from Alan's flat, and they just use his electricity. Yeah?
Someone told me recently, by the way, we all did that,
Right,
wherever we were living.
Allen Ginsberg was a rascal. He was amazing in many ways, but he was extremely promiscuous and he had a thing for young men. But he was also very generous.
Yes.
All with them, and he stayed friends with them. I
Yes.
think in all cases, actually. And he stayed friends with Arthur, didn't he? And he
Absolutely.
helped him. He was one of the people who kind of, possibly financially, possibly with his electricity supply, possibly spiritually because of their connection through Buddhism, or just by encouraging him to do his own thing, right?
And towards the end of his life, he sat with Arthur as he was dying.
Right.
And he gave Tom,
right.
his partner, respite when he was
Right.
caring for him.
Right.
And
Right.
after Arthur died, Alan worked very closely with Philip Glass. Tom speaks about how that really helped his grieving and that they protected Arthur's legacy. Alan was someone who wanted to facilitate things
Totally.
for people.
He was very, very generous. I mean, not just materially, but in terms of artistically.
Alan incants a Buddhist prayer at Arthur's memorial service as well, very beautifully. There's a really interesting memoir by someone called Kevin Killian called Fascination. He talks about meeting Arthur at some university concert of Alan's. Arthur having no way of getting home because Alan settled down for the evening with someone he's met. It's an incredible insight into the aura Alan could draw doing these college tours, and Stephen Hall and Arthur would be in the band and often be left to fend for themselves.
During this time, he has some almost like minor hits, doesn't he? Really,
Sure.
in terms of the clubby disco, electro stuff.
In this New York world we're talking about, crucially, this music, I think, is popular in the warehouse in Chicago, maybe, but it's very much a localized New York music. Go Bang, Is It All Over My Face? They definitely have serious airplay on WBLS, and they also sell well within this, let's call it a grey economy. And Arthur's frustrated because Is It All Over My Face definitely was a big hit in some of these clubs, and he never got properly accounted to. And he'd go into a record store and see copies and say, they told me it's out of print, they've reprinted it. Essentially, I've been bootlegged by my own record company. He called it keeping your head above water in Midtown, putting out those records. So partly he thought it was a way of, a club hit was a source of income. That's why he put that music out under so many different names. It's Loose Joints, Dinosaur L, Killer Whale, Indian Ocean later on. Sometimes it's just as easy as saying, well, I signed a contract with, it's straightforward as I can't sign a contract with those people. This time I'll be Killer Whale. Some money did come in from those 12 inches.
Let's talk a little bit about his relationship with the industry, as it were, and success, because Steve Knutson, who's through Audica has kind of become the archivist and put out a lot of stuff posthumously. He said something quite interesting, which was that Arthur was quite paranoid about anything to do with the music industry, and lots of people were. He said something which was quite funny but quite poignant, which was that if somebody told Arthur that they liked his music, he immediately became suspicious of them.
Yeah.
Maybe you could talk about his relationship with success, that when success came knocking, he sort of ran out the door.
He worked with Seymour Stein and Jeff Travis, who inarguably are two of the most significant people to ever run record companies. John Hammond saw something in him. Jerry Wexler, who recorded Aretha Franklin, worked at Atlantic. There's a note from him in the archive. Someone called Karen Berg, who was involved with signing R.E.M. and Husker Du to Warner Brothers, but was aware of Arthur. Philip Glass was his great champion. There's no way Arthur's creative work wasn't known within the music industry in New York. There were lots of opportunities. Now, it could be as basic as Arthur not trusting someone to be a manager or a lawyer. Not many people had managers and lawyers within that downtown milieu. Gary Kerfist, who managed Talking Head, Eurythmics and B-52s and Pretenders. He was someone who understood how to make the music industry work for people who wanted to do things on their own terms to a degree. But all those bands I mentioned are very easy to define. Their music's really clear and they wanted careers and they toured. Arthur didn't have that middle management part of his head that is required enough to settle on anything. Jeff Travis continually gave him significant amounts of money.
Because he believed in him, right?
He believed in it and he didn't give him deadlines. I think Arthur often had people championing him, but they weren't product managers or lawyers saying, we need this for next year and then we'll get the agent to book us a tour of the Midwest. He was something of an ingenue about how the record industry worked, but he'd also slightly been indulged by it. He'd put records out with Sire and West End, both of whom had pretty sharp practice in an era when the New York music industry was pretty mobbed up, to put it bluntly.
It was probably 2 o'clock in the morning. Francois had just finished a ref on a mix of Go Bang. I came with that ref to the club. So I get brought in like some dignitary bringing special news, and David just took the ref from me. He took off what he was about to play. I just leaned against the wall. I could see the people were first listening to it, and it was weird because they were trying to get into it. And then all of a sudden, they were going crazy for this record. Of course, Arthur walked up to me and said, I'm ruined. I'm ruined. I said, what do you mean? He goes, I'm ruined. He goes, did you listen to the drums? And I looked at him, he goes, Francois did this on purpose. I said, Arthur, what the fuck are you talking about? He said, the drums aren't strong enough. They're a little muddy. There should be more. I said, Arthur, you're out of your fucking mind. People are going crazy here. And then he would sort of smile a minute later, and he goes, well, that's great.
And this image of him stalking the streets of Lower East Side and always with headphones on.
Yeah.
Any time that he had or money that he had, he'd be in studios recording. I thought maybe you could talk a little about his process, because what really comes over is that he made this vast number of recordings which have been coming out posthumously, but he seemed to be both a perfectionist, so do 40 mixes of one track, but also got that thing about never really been able to finish things. So like do 90% of it, then get bored and move on. But just wanted to be in the studio recording, playing it to people. Was there something in the way?
Well, that's a really good question, and that's what we'll never know. I mean, there must have been. Partly, I think if he had deadlines, he might have adhered to them. If the contracts he had were more sort of straitjackety. It's interesting that he released World of Echo in his lifetime, because that was recorded on videotape.
Huh.
And there's something about the fact that there wasn't much of it. Let's say 3 or 4 recordings on video that he turned into a record. It's a very, very small canvas compared to the rest of his work, which consisted largely of nothing but audio tape in every part of his apartment. Audio tape hanging everywhere. He's continually doing edits by hand at home. But World of Echo came out, and I think partly it came out because he was using video and he was limited by what it could be. We probably have to consider his Buddhism within this. Something's always emerging. I think his ability to conceive of what he wanted things to be and his frustration that they weren't quite there might have been a factor.
In one's imagination, you've got an idea, could be a song, could be a book, could be a painting, and you have this sort of initial inspiration about how great it could be. And then as you get closer to finishing it, you realise it's not going to be that. It might be good, it might even be great, but it's not going to be quite as star-like as it seemed at the beginning. And there's a sort of fear sometimes, isn't there, in the creative process of actually finishing, because then you've actually got to put it out in the world and it gets judged.
I think that's exactly it. I mean, even instrumentals, his first major composition, he envisaged that being able to be played for hours. And there's also maybe with the dance music a sense of actually we just need to get this 12-inch out and get some money.
Right. Well, you write books. I mean, when's a book finished?
Never finished.
Right. When's a song finished? If you've got to deliver at some point, right, you've got contracts and stuff like that. That's when it's finished.
Yeah, he had that kind of pressure when he was doing that dance floor. But also, that's a very fast-moving world. You don't want to put something that sounds a year old. You have to hit that moment. There are factors, but I think some of it is to do with his personality and this sort of sense of letting go being really, really, really hard. And choreographer Alison Schlesinger, who Arthur played cello for and was great friends with, said that she went to see Arthur play a show once, and some people came up and said how much they liked his music and how really that happened, and how he really liked, I'd really like cute boys to come up to me and tell me how wonderful they think I am. So there is something going on there. And Stephen Hall in the book says Stephen was about to sign a contract with Sleeping Bag Records, which Arthur had founded with Will Sokolov. He talked Stephen out of signing it. On the one hand, you have this incredible, generous, ocean-like person who seems to contain the stillness and the mystery of the universe. Then you hear it when he plays his cello, you hear his voice, and you just hear this incredible sense of peace and openness. And on the other hand, you have this pretty paranoid person who finds social situations quite awkward. Tom, his partner, said they went back to his mother's house at one of the first times Arthur had seen MTV, and he just spent the whole time looking at MTV and didn't speak to anyone. After he died, Arthur's father, Chuck Charles, Senior, would go on panels and talk about Arthur with his contemporaries. And they talk about how difficult Arthur could be, how hard he could be to communicate with. And Arthur's father found a huge degree of solace in all this. He thought, I thought that was just us. I thought that was family.
Right. Yeah.
So all that's part of who he was.
We don't want to get into post-diagnosing people.
No.
I mean, you can see what might have been going on there, actually, possibly. Yeah. But I mean, and just for the listeners, he left behind more than 1,000 tapes when he died. 40 of them different mixes of one song. The estate consists of 800 reels of 2-inch and 1/4-inch tape, a few hundred cassettes, several dozen DAT tapes, hundreds and hundreds of pages of song lyrics and poetry. And your book actually has got a lot of the stuff that you from his life, the ephemera, wonderful handwritten things and drawn stuff. But you mentioned then personal life. Tom, his partner, and he died of an age-related illness, throat cancer, and of course that time in New York and San Francisco and here, it's easy to forget, isn't it, I suppose. I had John Savage in a couple of weeks ago, and John had written this book about queerness in pop, and he deliberately stopped it at 78, which was the advent of AIDS. And what a devastating time that would have been in those communities. There were so many people just getting mown down, weren't they?
There's an incredible book by Sarah Schulman called The Gentrification of the Mind, which is about the effect of HIV-AIDS on the Lower East Side, and the fact that the bereaved partners of the deceased, if they're in a same-sex relationship, rarely were recognised by landlords as next of kin. So there was a sort of clearance of unwanted tenants as a consequence of it. The first time I went to New York, I was with a family member, and she's about 93, I think. We were having lunch, and she said, I can't tell you how many people I know looking around who's lived in those apartments who've all died. Peter Gordon is a great friend and colleague of Arthur's and collaborator, talks very movingly about all the people who just died so quickly. Lucy Sant, who was Luke Sant, and has transitioned, worked in the Strand bookstore, and I think says 60 or 70% of their colleagues died of HIV-AIDS. So, yeah, I mean, Arthur and Tom, they were together over 12 years. Tom went out to work every day, supported Arthur. I think it's an incredibly loving relationship. And after Arthur died, Arthur's family really did accept Tom as one of the family. He lives most of the time in Maine, very close to Arthur's sister.
Description of the apartment, which was just music stuff, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's Tom sort of trying to also have a sort of working life and sleep and stuff in there. And it's just massive amounts of gear and tape.
Yes, Tom worked as a screen studio and did a lot of artwork for Arthur, flyers and record covers. They were a family, Tom and Arthur.
Was a tragedy amongst many. I mean, we tend to, with artists and writers and people of cultural significance, we sort of tend to, for some reason, see it as more of a tragedy than if the guy who runs the greengrocers dies. There's many, many tragedies. It's tragedy in his case, I suppose, for his family and Tom and his friends and that milieu, but also there's always that question is that, if he'd survived, what else would he have done? Would he have been able to marshal himself and be more disciplined and, and produced more focused stuff, even got the success that you think he craved? You mentioned you like the admiration of young, cute boys, but I mean, did he really crave success?
I think he did.
Okay.
I think he really did, yeah.
Okay. But success for him would have meant what? Accolades?
That's a good question.
I mean, he seemed to live his life exactly the way he wanted to, which was making music. If he was awake, he was kind of doing music, wasn't he?
I think he saw people he knew like Laurie Anderson, Steve Reich, Philip Glass, Peter Gordon to a degree, David Byrne, Jerry Harrison. He knew all these people and he saw them achieve a fairly phenomenal amount of success. We'll never know, but I assume he'd have liked, say, half of what they had, say, or equivalent to Laurie Anderson. And this is pure speculation. One thing I'm very aware of was towards the end of his life, when he really was incredibly industrious and productive, he had incredible control over his home studio. And he died 5-6 years before the advent of things like Cubase and later on Pro Tools.
I'm going to take a separate path from you there, because to the extent that I know about him, the danger, I think, for Arthur would have been when Cubase, when software comes along, with its infinite undos.
That's true.
Never have finished anything at all, because you can just keep undoing and endless variations. It's the curse of sort of software, isn't it?
You could have driven him absolutely even further into his own self, to the point where he couldn't have completed anything.
Thanks to various people around him people like Steve Knutson later, a lot of more and more of his absolutely astounding work has been released, and with a lot of care, with a lot of technical editing. Peter Broderick was been involved, hasn't he? And, bringing these dusty, lo-fi tape recordings, into the brightness of the modern world. It is a whole world. Your book is the kind of visual counterpart of it. So he's got an afterlife, hasn't he, Arthur Russell?
Last weekend we had this concert in Brooklyn, and I made the point that Tower of Meaning was receiving its premiere in America, never mind New York, to an audience that Arthur never got near. There was a few thousand people there, and equally at the Barbican, Tom said there are more people here tonight than probably Arthur ever played.
Right.
There's a sadness to that, and a melancholy, but the afterlife means the music is living and breathing, and it doesn't feel to me, at least, like archaeology. Everything to do with Arthur there is a strange intimacy at work, and the listener, I hope the reader, you form your own relationship with Arthur. Now, the most important thing is that you form a connection. But I don't know how many people there are who engender quite such levels of devotion.
Well, listeners, if you don't know about Arthur Russell, you are in for a major treat. And if you have been your interest has been piqued by what we talked about today, I recommend Richard's book, Travels Over Feeling. It's a beautiful thing, probably by Faber. Richard, thanks very much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
It's been a pleasure, Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you to Richard for that. I'll put details of his book about Arthur Russell in the show notes. It really is a beautiful thing. And thanks to Dan from Faber, thanks to Steve Knutson at Audica Records, and thanks to Kat Corrigan at Beggar's Banquet for letting us play out some of Arthur's music. That was just a tiny taster of the depth and breadth of it. You can go and check it out at your usual outlets. Also, we heard a couple of clips from Matt Wolf's film Wild Combination, a portrait of Arthur Russell. Something about Arthur gave me real confidence in the muse, in the artistic imperative. His life is somewhat of a tragedy, as we discussed, really because it came to an early end, but in many ways it was a very full life in terms of his music, his friends, his art. He resolutely did his own thing, sort of irrespective really of all the mores and demands of an industry, which of course, as we discussed, was maybe reflected in his lack of success in an obvious way in his lifetime, but of course contributed to the work and the breadth of that work that he put out for us to enjoy. I think I've got a bit of a personal stake in this because my own history as a musician and with the music industry was one of never really been able to do the same thing twice, and having this kind of wide range of influences and interests, which particularly at the beginning made it quite difficult because record companies really like to be able to put their marketing behind a specific story, and it's quite difficult for them if you're all over the place, as Arthur was, and to some extent as I have been. What's happened more recently, because of streaming, etc., is that audiences everywhere are much more wide-ranging and listen to all sorts of stuff, and I think that probably has made it a lot easier for artists to cross the musical landscape. And I wonder, as we discussed, if Arthur was around now, whether he would get a much wider audience in his own lifetime. But we shall never know. Thanks to you for listening, and keep listening. BureauofLostCulture.com is the archive where all our shows are now gathered. You can sign up for our bulletin, as I mentioned, and write to us with your suggestions. I particularly like to hear about musical treasures that you have uncovered that maybe the rest of us don't know so much about, it's great to share those. But for now, until next time, when we meet again further down the road, over the hillsides and round the bend, let's finish with some more of Arthur's music. This is his song, In Love With You, for the last time. See you.
Now I'm in love with you for the last time. It's the last time I'll sit on this bench with you. And from what you say, I guess it's past time, and I'll never see you again. I don't understand why you got tears in your eyes. It's not what you wanted to show me. It's hard what you said, and I don't see why you act like you never did know me. Now I'm in love with you for the last time. It's the last time I'll sit on this bench with you. And from what you say, I guess it's past time, and I'll never see you again. Well, that's all I can say. Now I walk away. I'll keep going till I'm so far on, and I'll never come back to this place, not today, and find out that you really are gone. Now I'm in love with you for the last time. It's the last time I'll sit on this bench with you. And from what you say, I guess it's past time, and I'll never see you again. Now when I start to think, that's when I start to sink. I'll just keep moving without you. I never will talk, and I never will blink, and I'll never hear nothing about you. Now you've rejected me for the last time. It's the last time I'll sit on this fence for you. And from what you say, I guess it's past time, and I'll never see you again.